Thank you, Hakan, for this introduction, and thank you all for being here. I don't really know why so many of you are here. I had to be here because both of my families, my two great-grandmothers were Turkish. So I feel that I have a obligation to respond to any Turkish invitation I receive. The situation in the Middle East is getting to be very complex, and one of the things I've noticed is how ill-informed the media is. Most particularly about what I would consider basic facts. And I'll just give you an example. Most people, for a period of time, thought that because Mubarak had appointed a vice president, that the vice president was going to succeed him. And it was sort of common belief. And very interestingly, it seems like the Department of State and the White House, the NSC, were supporting that proposition. Well, I can understand wishful thinking. He was the choice of the United States. But for them not to have spent the time to have somebody tell them that in the Constitution, the Vice President does not succeed in case of a vacancy, it's the Speaker of the House, it seems to me was a rather crucial factor, especially if U.S. foreign policy was predicated in part on the fact that this succession would occur. Let me start with some basic facts, which some of you may know, but I think this would be an important foundation. Egypt has a population estimated at 81 to 84 million people. It has grown over 30 million people in less than 30 years. Over 50% of the population is under the age of 30. Over 50% unemployment in that age category. Also, within the age bracket of 21 to 30 is the highest percentage of unemployed who are university graduates, approximately 60%. In the category of below 21, illiteracy is about 60%. The rate of income of over half of the population, that's about 40 million people, is between $2 and $5 a day. $2 a day is the poverty level. Now, compare that for the price of an alcoholic beverage in one of the main hotels in Cairo. It would be the equivalent of 3 to 5 working days for about 25 million people. One drink. One dinner at a hotel for one person will be the equivalent of 2 to 3 months' work. This is to give you an idea of what some of the underlying facts are. Again, in terms of absolute numbers, the estimates is between 30 and 40 million people live in such a high density living area that you're speaking of 4 to 7 persons in a room. An apartment of this size would probably be inhabited by 2 families of an average of 7 to 8 people. The housing crisis is significant. And if somebody would ask, well, why is the housing crisis in such a situation? Somebody would come and say, well, you know, housing requires cement and steel. You would say, yeah, so what? Well, lo and behold, about 5 years ago, a man in his 40s, who happens to have become the Secretary General of the National Democratic Party by the name of Mr. Is, who last week was arrested. Mr. Is was given by the Mubarak regime a monopoly of all of the steel production factories in Egypt. At the time he acquired that monopoly, he increased the price of steel from $2,000 per ton to $9,000 per ton. The justification for the regime was that with the profits that he was going to make, he was going to fund the National Democratic Party so that their candidates would be more sure of winning. What it of course did, it showed that government industry owned by the government, paid by the public, paid by the taxpayers, was given away in a corrupt transaction to the Secretary General of the party, who immediately profited from it by increasing the prices to the point where it was impossible for any normal construction projects to go on, except for those that would be very high yield projects, which was certainly not low and middle income construction. The same thing happened in cement. Somebody else very close to the ruling party received it. 90% of Egypt's wealth is in the hands of about 200 families who are the oligarchy that control the country. It was not only this extraordinary concentration of wealth and power, but it was also the fact that the Ministry of Interior, which had grown from about 100,000 persons to over 350,000 persons. Imagine a police department of 350,000 persons, buying armored personnel trucks and some small tanks to compete with the Ministry of Defense, became actually the protectors of the regime. They became the enforcers of the regime. The constant prison population in Egypt for the last 10 years is about 15,000 people. Now, to have a constant prison population of 15,000 people, statistically, it means you have to arrest 150,000 persons a year. Now, think of an arrest of 150,000. Obviously, over the 10-year period, many of them were duplicate arrests. But the estimate is close to 1 million persons have been arrested in a span of 10 years, exclusively on the proposition that they were opposed to the regime. It's estimated that 1 out of 2 detainees is tortured, and certainly every person who is detained is physically abused. Slapping, kicking, punching is not even considered in the category of torture. And it is rampant, routine, openly done, no supervision, no professional standards, nothing. The United States has for years known of that. It appears in the State Department annual report of different countries, because that's required by legislation. It's required by legislation because under US law, a country that violates human rights is not entitled to receive foreign aid. So the United States government acted, some would benevolently say in a schizophrenic manner, others would say in very simple terms, human rights, the Constitution that we have, the principles that we have, all of that is good for public consumption, but it's not really good for our neo-imperialistic goals. And our neo-imperialistic goals are to make sure that Egypt does what we want it to do. And that's why, since 1979, and at the time I was a legal advisor to President Sadat on the peace treaty, and so I was very much involved in that. But as of 1979, Egypt has received $1.3 billion of military aid. Now, mind you well, this is not civilian aid. This is not money going to the people. This is equipment going to the military. Now, there's a little bit of skullduggery there by the Defense Department, and most people think, oh my goodness, we're giving away $1.3 billion. It's not exactly that. It's $1.3 billion in military equipment that the Pentagon is giving Egypt, which means that whatever surplus they have, or whatever equipment they're not really interested in, or whatever they can sell the Egyptians on, they will transfer that merchandise, if I can call it that, to the Egyptians, figure out how much the cost is originally when it was purchased, or whatever contract it was, and then basically charge it to the US Treasury, for which they get a credit. And then after that, they use the credit to acquire whatever new weapons and things they want. So the $1.3 billion, if you were dealing with a sort of a purchase on the open market, my guess is would be about 40% of the value. But so be it. The point is, all of these toys went to the military to keep the military satisfied and on the side of the US government. There wasn't really much concern with economic development, and everybody in Egypt and in the United States were satisfied with the fact that there were so-called foreign investments and new projects. Undoubtedly, there were foreign investments, there were projects. Now let's stop for a minute and look at that, and that is where a number of you who are friends asked me if I was somewhat optimistic, and big question mark. And this is where the big question mark situation comes from. A scheme was developed by the oligarchy approximately 10, 15 years back. It sort of took some time to work itself out. This was the time at which the Mubarak regime had decided to sell off all government property. So people who were close to the government would know, for example, when this piece of land would go on the block, or when this factory would go on the block, or when this industry would go on the block, and they would have the inside track buying it. Financing would be arranged by the bank. And so if you knew that factory X was going up for sale, and that you were the insider, and most people didn't even know where the sale would take place, you would come in with a sealed bid, you would be told what the sealed bid was, and you would have a letter of credit from a government-controlled bank. You would suddenly own the factory. Now that you've owned the factory, you would then re-evaluate the factory. It would not be evaluated on the basis of the sale price, because this was a fire sale. So suddenly this particular factory, which you bought for 10, is valued by an accounting or whatever firm is going to do the valuation at 80 or 90. Now you have two choices. You can either keep it and run it, or you can sell it. Well, if you want a quick turnover, you do what some of these people did about 8 months ago. One of the main public banks, called the Bank of Alexandria, was put on the block. This operation happened in the same way as I'm telling you. The Bank of Alexandria was sold in this absolutely fraudulent way, but openly fraudulent way. I mean, they make no bones about it. And it was bought by this particular individual for a price. Again, this is estimate. Nobody knows exactly. Estimate of $2 billion. The fascinating thing is, that's why I'm telling you, was done in an unabashed way. Not the day after, but the day after. The person resold the bank to a Saudi Gulf conglomerate for $8 billion. And both figures were in the press at a distance of 3 days, or 2.5 days, but with the press being delayed. This is not only to describe to you the level of corruption, but it's to describe to you the unabashed nature of it. It's rubbing it in the nose of the people, and particularly the poor people. And of course, they couldn't care less. The 200 families couldn't care less. They've got the police supporting them. The army is totally marginalized, by the way, sits on the side, says, I don't want to have anything to do with the politics. I'm having my own little benefits. You know, the army is not holier than thou. The army controls private sector industry that amounts to 20% of the economy. And they do everything from bottled water, which is sold publicly, to doing refrigerators and stoves and all sorts of things which they're selling. Now, some of you may think, well, there's nothing wrong in that. But there's nothing wrong in that, except that because it's the army, it doesn't pay income tax or real estate tax or any type of tax. And when it exports, it doesn't pay any tax. And because it doesn't have to report its income, because it doesn't pay tax, nobody knows how much income it makes. And if nobody knows how much income it makes, nobody also knows where that income is going. So there's a nice little deal going on for the army folks, which is usually reserved for the senior people. Very little trickles down. Reagan economics trickle-down effect has not reached that part of the world. Those who are at the top tend to keep what they get, and that's about it. The trickle-down effect is only if you work for them, and then they'll pay you less than what you are entitled to for a salary or for services. So you look at all of that and you say, you know, this is a pretty explosive situation. Now let me get back to the economics. What they did in the investment area, where a lot of money has gone in, and on paper, reports made by Egypt to the World Bank, the IMF as well, showed that there was significant investment coming in at a certain level. The problem is nobody has really analyzed these investments. And to the best of my ability to find a word for it, they have two characteristics. One is they remind me of a form of art which in French is called trompe-l'œil. Trompe-l'œil is a design, and you can see it, there's a building at the corner of, I think, Chicago and LaSalle, where you have a huge drawing on something like that. And the trompe-l'œil is that the drawing looks like the building, but it's canvas. It's not a building, it's canvas. So you have a lot of trompe-l'œil investments. And the way these investments work, again, it's my analogy, sometimes lack imagination, but it's what I call a U-turn operation. The U-turn. The U-turn comes like this. Let's assume this will go back to the person who has acquired a factory for 10 cents on the dollar. That person then values the factory, and the factory is valued at 100 cents. The person then says, I will withdraw from the original investments 50%. Yeah, reasonable. So he goes to the bank, he funds the project, which is valued at 100, for 50%. So he takes a loan from the bank for 50. Now remember, he's got 10 in it. So he takes a loan of 50. He puts his 10 in his pocket. He's whole now. The 40% then goes abroad. Corporation is established. Corporation is a foreign investment company. That person owns whatever capital the company is capitalized at, but with the 40% that person put in. That person may keep the company at 40%, or that person may seek other investors who would come in. But let's keep it at the 40% of this person. That person then brings the money back into Egypt as a foreign investment. Underline the word foreign, very important. A foreign investment has to be approved by something called the Foreign Investment Authority, which is a government agency. Very important, because If the project is approved by the Foreign Investment Authority, A, that project is entitled to have favorable bank loans, and B, you're entitled to take all of your money back out again, including your profits. On its face, it's fairly reasonable. You want to encourage foreign investments, but you want to encourage genuine foreign investments. But this is originally local money, which found its way out. It's now coming back, and you now have a project with the 40, whatever it is, that came in, which is the capital. You go with the 40 and you say, you know what I want to do? I want to do a tourism resort. And so you go, still part of the whole oligarchy, to the Ministry of Tourism, and you want to get a piece of land in the Sinai or in Sharm el-Sheikh. Well, you know, you want to make sure you get that. You get one of Mubarak's son in, you negotiate with him at 10 to 20% of the deal, or somebody else like him. Now you've got that support, and you go to the Ministry of Tourism, which authorizes you to build a hotel in Sharm el-Sheikh. And the Ministry of Tourism, because you're a foreign investor approved by foreign investment, obtains a grant of land for you. The grant of land is at a nominal price. A nominal price on a scale of 1 to 10 would be equivalent to 1. The moment you get your land, you've already made the difference between 1 and 10. Now, you now have a project which is valued at the 40 you brought in, plus the difference between 1 and 10 on the value of the property. You add those up, and you've got a significant project. And sure, you go ahead and you build your hotel. It is a profitable deal, and it looks good. Later to be identified as a former intelligence officer who was assigned by the Minister of Defense to set up a corporation in Delaware to take contracts from the Defense Department to transport the military equipment, which is part of our foreign aid assistance, to Egypt. All right, no problem with that. So there's a company that receives the contract, and, you know, why not an Egyptian making the profit? Problem is, this guy who had absolutely no idea of transportations or contracts or things like that, saw that things at the Defense Department were done on a very routine basis. So he went and hired a former CIA agent to give him further cover. And the two of them said, well, you know, this looks like, you know, there's an Arabic word that has its origin in a Turkish word called tekiye. So why don't we increase the shipping of airplanes by 15%? They got paid for it. And they kept on going until they billed up to 50%. What they didn't realize is that the Defense Department was paying, but that these statements were being audited, and that there was a period of time between the payment and the audit. And sure enough, when all these bills got to the audit department 7, 8, 9, 10 months later, they said, wait a minute, don't these people know that there is a schedule of what can be charged? They had no idea that there was an already established schedule. You know, a tank weighing so much, you know, would get so much, an airplane wing weighing so much. So they charged them with a crime, that they were defrauding the US government. So here were these two chaps, former Egyptian intelligence officer, former CIA officer, were charged with a crime. And so they asked me, would you go and represent the man? So I went and looked into the file, and I said, I'll be damned if I'm going to represent these crooks. And I didn't. Well, the Egyptian government did everything possible to save the guy's neck, and they made a deal on political grounds. And the guy, who's, I'll use his first name, Mahmoud, made a deal and basically fled the country. And his attorney pled him guilty, and he received a probationary charge, with, of course, a prohibition of returning to the United States. Lo and behold, I discovered that before fleeing the country, he took $17 million out of this government-owned company, which was transporting the equipment for Egypt, and then sent it to Switzerland, and from there to Spain. And guess what? Many of you have seen over the years this beautiful hotel in Sharm el-Sheikh, where all of the heads of state summits take place. And if some of you go and visit it, you'll see on the rooms a plaque, you know, King Hussein slept here, President Clinton slept here, you know, so on and so forth. Well, to my great surprise, I found that there was a Spanish company that made the U-turn operation and invested $17 million, got the land for a minor price, built the hotel, gave Ala Mubarak, the older son of Hosni Mubarak, 19% ownership of the company, and of course Hosni Mubarak patronized it with all of these meetings that took place there. The reason I'm telling you that, then you would say, gee, I mean, this should be a top secret tip. The unabashed nature of the regime was such that this became known in Egypt, and stories were written about it in the newspapers. And it didn't faze Mubarak one bit. So, having reached that point, you have to understand that the Egyptian people had to explode. So, this is the background. In a sense, this explosion is the continuation of the Egyptian anti-colonial movement. Why do I say anti-colonial movement? Because Egypt and many other Arab countries were colonized. And the first successor waves of the colonial regimes were corrupt monarchies and corrupt military regimes. They followed their prior colonial model. They continued to deal with their prior colonial masters, whether it's England, France, or the United States, which became the successor colonial power in that part of the world. And they continued to exploit the people, much as the former colonial powers exploited the people. In 1952, there was a revolution, which was more of a military coup in Egypt. And what we see now is more or less the same situation. The military are in control. Constitution was suspended, but you know it's not much of a constitution. The two houses of parliament were dissolved, but they were all elected fraudulently anyway, so there's no great loss there. The government appointed by Mubarak is still running the country. Everybody thinks that because he has changed 13 members of cabinet, that's great, which probably is. But 16 of the former members of his cabinet remain. So you have a cabinet consisting of 29, 13 new, 16 old, the 13 new are all part of the regime. The military is controlling. There's something called the Superior Council of the Armed Forces. They're in control. General Tantawi is in control. He's about 76 years old, very old guard, and not much vision or imagination. Not likely to change much. There's going to be some minor changes in the Constitution. Everybody is hoping it's going to be democracy and openness and whatnot. No such deal. Maybe 4 or 5 articles of the Constitution will be changed. That will be announced in 2 days from now. They're going to make it public for a week. And here's the interesting gimmick. You want democracy? It's going to be public. It's going to be in all of the newspapers, and the citizens are going to be asked to write in to the committee what their thoughts are. And of course, the committee will then see if there's any need for revision. And then it'll be submitted to a public referendum, which is yes or no. Take it or leave it. And then from then we move on. My fear is that there is going to be very little democracy. There are little democratic changes. The regime is going to stay the same. You will see new faces. The new faces will be trumpeted and heralded as reformists and progressive people. Probably some of them will be. I think it's going to take some time for them to be corrupted by power before they themselves become corrupt or abusive. but at least in a period of time in which this is not happening, there's going to be some reform and some change. I think the military is primarily concerned with preserving security and public safety. They don't want the economy to crumble and people to go out in the street and use violence. But nobody really knows at this point what is going to happen if the economic crisis blows up. What's the economic crisis? The discovery that the Egyptian bank have an enormous debt, much as what we had as a financial crisis in this country, where you basically had paper that wasn't worth anything. And the banks will be holding the notes and the papers for the U-turn investments and all of these phony investments, all of these trompe-l'oeil investments. And the tragic thing is it will be discovered that the central bank has guaranteed all of these loans. Central bank is not going to be in a position to do anything. The value of the pound is going to go down. Inflation is going to go up. For 50% of the population living at the margins of poverty, imagine an inflation that is only 20 to 30%, and I'm not going to tell you much more than that. You can imagine what the reaction is. People will lack basic supplies. The flour and bread will be missing. People will be out in the street. And at that point, yes, it will be violent and bad. Now, can it be stopped? The answer is yes. The government can be smart enough to keep a lid on it so that nobody knows about it, or they can get some type of arrangement with the IMF and some emergency loans from the World Bank to shore the currency. In that case, they can avert the crises and things may go on. Obviously, as everybody realizes, there's an impending economic crisis. Even if it does not happen, it will mean that demands for democracy are going to be moderated significantly. So, you know, there is a best case and a worst case scenario. The best case scenario is not much democracy, a little bit of reform, a little bit of a facelift to the regime. The military will continue to control and things will go on. The rest of the Arab world presents different challenges. Each country has its separate challenge. Probably the biggest hotspots are both Libya and Algeria. Algeria has not exploded yet, but it's likely to. Between 10 and 15 years back, Algeria had a civil war in which over 100,000 people were killed. It was on nobody's radar screen. The West didn't care about it, the United States didn't care about it. It reminded me very much of the attitude of the United States during the period 75-85 in Cambodia, where anywhere between 1 million to 2 million people were killed, and the United States just didn't see it. It was off its radar screen. Algeria was off its radar screen, and my guess is if there is a blow up in Algeria, it's likely to be quite bloody. In the meantime, Libya is bound to be bloody. You know, it already is. Gaddafi is known to, you know, I'm not a psychiatrist, but I would like to loosely use the term crazy. And he's always been known to be, you know, a crazy character, doing crazy things. He spent most of the country's money fomenting wars and revolutions in Africa, paying money to all sorts of extremist groups in the world, totally unreliable and quite likely to increase the level of violence. Again, with no Western media in there, nobody keeping an eye on it. You know, I think the United States is going to probably shift the problem to Europe and say, you know, this is a European problem because Italy, France, Spain are the countries, and England most dealing with them and have the oil concessions, so you deal with them, and that's a way for the US to not to do anything. Europe is not likely to do anything, as you will know. So who knows where this crisis is going to lead us. Bahrain is a different story. Small population, less than 500,000. Fifth Fleet is there, strategically very important to the US. Particularly difficult situation to handle because the royal family is Sunni, very closely allied with the royal family in Saudi Arabia. The royal family in Saudi Arabia is telling the Bahrainis to hold tight. They certainly don't want to have a Shia foothold In the peninsula, they don't want Iran to have any influence through the Shia. There's just a causeway between Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabian troops are already poised on the other side of the causeway in Saudi Arabian territory. Worst comes to worst, they would come in and shore up the Bahraini royal family. U.S. is pushing as much as it can to get things to quiet down. I think the Bahraini royal family are smart enough to sort of try to play this crisis out, and I think they're going to take a cue from the way the military played it out in Egypt, and so I don't foresee, from a strategic point of view, many upheavals in Bahrain, but they're going to have to make some major reforms in terms of giving more democracy to the people there. There, it's not an economic issue. When you have a per capita income of $24,000 per person, you don't have the economic problem of somebody living on $2 a day. But you do have an issue of representation and democracy, and that will be a change. In Tunisia, as you know, the military are in total control. No likelihood, in my opinion, that anything develops in Syria for the time being. I think Lebanon has always lived on a delicate and precarious balance and will continue to live on it like that. And I think it will go from one crisis to another for a long period of time, but it will ultimately survive these crises. So that's not going to be of any great significance. But all of that means that the Middle East situation, the Middle East countries are going to be in a state of flux. They will involve much attention on the part of the United States. I don't know how much attention span our government can have for any issue in the world in view of the very pressing issues. If you were sitting in the White House and you've got to deal with Wisconsin and maybe Ohio and other issues involving labor law and other domestic political issues, you know, there's just so much time you can spend on Egypt, Libya, Bahrain, Tunisia, etc.
It's always Egyptians in medicine.
Yes, you know, somebody promised to send me a picture, which I'm looking forward to get, and that is a picture of a sign of somebody in Cairo said, "The Egyptian Revolution supports Madison, Wisconsin." I'm looking forward to getting it. But I don't know if you know, the Tea Partiers are saying that it's the Egyptians who have fomented this whole thing in Madison. It goes to show you that, you know, we're really living in the age of globalization.
Yeah, really.
And if we could just make sure that values and principles were also globalized, and that governments and people would abide by these values instead of resorting to violence and dehumanization. I didn't intend to be pessimistic. To me, the ability to make as objective an assessment of a situation is really the first step that one takes in order to deal with the problems and try to find solutions. And all too often we don't make these types of, you know, of assessments. I honestly don't think that the situation is desperate, but I don't see any visionary leaders. I mean, I'll give you an example. From my first experience in '78, after the signing of Camp David, being in the White House when the agreement was signed, I thought 2-3 years, everything's going to be solved. There's no reason for the Middle East to be in conflict. There's no reason for the Palestinians, the Israelis, not have a two-state solution. And well, here we are, how many years later? It's still not happening. And it's not because objectively the foundation isn't there. Everybody knows what the proper rational approach should be, but nobody has the vision and the courage to follow what needs to be done. In fact, a lot of people are saying that what's happening in Egypt is likely to follow the Turkish model, that the army is going to be the guarantor of democracy. It's going to be in the background. In case there's any abuses, it steps in. It creates the institutions. It more or less shapes who is in and who is out. It could very well be. It could very well be. There's some differences. And the differences are, and I know there are a lot of Arabs in the room, and a lot of Turks, and I hope I'm not going to offend everybody. No, but in this case, it doesn't apply to Jews. This case applies only to Arabs and Turks. Turks are very disciplined people. Arabs are very undisciplined people. Yeah, what could work in Turkey may not work in the Arab world. You know, I mean, when it comes to, well, I'll take an example. Yeah, somebody like me who came out of Egypt, and you know, you have a choice between getting up early to go to work or staying up late and enjoying life. You know, you stay up late, you enjoy life. Tomorrow is another day. You Turks are more bullheaded and hard worker and more disciplined, and so I don't know if the Arabs will be able to follow, but it certainly is a possibility.
Yes.
I know several tenured professors at DePaul, as well as many of the schools. The Arab monies are well known to fund the universities here. DePaul is the largest Catholic university in the country, and it's well known they have many anti-Semitic activities there. Now, what I'd like...
I've been there for 47 years. I haven't heard of one of them.
Really? Okay.
Not at the law school, anyway.
No, at the law school they have a Jewish studies division.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know, but what I wanted to know is how this is going to affect the relationship between Israel and Egypt, between Turkey and Egypt and Israel. The Saudis have a great deal of money. When the terrorist bomber was released from Scotland that was responsible for killing 280 people, he was released supposedly on humanitarian grounds. He's still alive 4 times longer than he was supposed to be, and he was released because England put pressure on Scotland because Saudi made an agreement with England for oil. Now, what I want to know is this going to happen? Is there going to be a lot of Arab money going?
Yeah, the one thing I would caution you against is believing in conspiratorial theories. You know, I mean, human imagination can just spin so many of these stories. To the best of my knowledge, I don't know of any university in Illinois that has received a penny of money from Saudi Arabia. They have funded a program at Harvard and one program at Georgetown, but I don't know beyond that. The idea that the Saudi money is going to come and influence our American universities and our American thinkers, that's very far-fetched. Now, concerning Egypt and Israel, it's a done deal. It's a done deal. We've got a peace treaty. It's a done deal. Now, that doesn't mean that the Egyptians are going to like the Israelis. That's another story.
They never did.
That's okay. Yeah. There's 2 deserts between Egypt and Israel. One side says you live on your side of the border, and the other side you live on. That's fine. They don't have to love each other. I mean, we have the Consul General of Bosnia and a few people from Bosnia here. They don't particularly like the Serbs, but they don't have to like them. So long as the Serbs are on their side of the border, or the Croatians on their side of the border, fine. The world can go on. It's a big world, and the sun is big, and it can shine on everybody in the universe. So I don't think that's an issue. Now, what you'll see in a more democratic Egypt is more criticism of Israel. In its dealings with the Palestinians and others. But you know what? I mean, if we're going to argue for democracy and human rights, I mean, let that be part of the international discourse.
I'd like to start with the fact that the Egyptian military would not fire on the civilians.
Correct.
Well, what I was wondering is the Egyptian military really monolithic, or is there a division between, say, the lower level officers and the generals? And is it possible that the lower level officers and the rank and file of the Egyptian military will side with the protesters in Tahrir Square and enforce a real democracy?
Yeah. The people at Tahrir Square were mostly younger people. They were organized by younger people. They were all under 35. Half of them, if not more, were university graduates. They used Facebook and Twitter. Their coordinator was the Google representative for the Middle East. And do you know who was the person orchestrating all of the demonstrations in Cairo? You'll never believe it. A 36-year-old single mother. 36-year-old mother who was an English teacher, born and bred in Egypt, with her 10-year-old girl. They took an apartment outside Tahrir Square. Her 10-year-old girl spent the whole 14 days with her, sleeping on the floor of that building. And that woman was running the whole show, you know. And personally, things like this are, to me, extraordinarily encouraging, because, you know, it means that you know, all of these artificial barriers with women and discrimination against women, really, when it comes down to it, don't exist in the psyche of the people. Another very important factor is, you know, a lot of people have made a great deal to do with the division of religion. And you would look at Tahrir Square in particular, and you would see a large number of Christians. You would see sometimes when the Muslims would pray, the Christians would make a cordon around them. I saw a picture of a Coptic priest being carried on the shoulders of some. There was another guy whose picture was sent to me. He was sleeping and he had sunglasses, and he had a crescent on one side and a cross on the other. You know, things like this are extremely encouraging. But whether or not that will transpire to the top, I don't know. Now, facts. The army consists of 452,000 conscripts. Now, these are people from the people. You know, they don't have connections to get out of being conscripted. So you know they're lower economic level. These people will never fire on their brethren. You know, this is not Libya, where Gaddafi is bringing in mercenaries from Africa and other countries. This is not Bahrain, where most of their police is from Pakistan and other countries. I mean, these are the same folks coming from the same farms. So that's not going to happen. Rank and file officers are the same level. The one thing that throws off this equation is the age bracket. That is, the senior officers are of an older generation. But other than that, it's not going to happen. But you have to remember something very important. Culture. The military, no matter where they are, who they are, have a certain culture. And there's a certain culture of discipline, of obedience to superior orders, you know. So if things are well organized, you know, the military will be a strong stabilizing force. If we get to the point of, you know, orders to shoot the people, probably the senior military are not going to call on the conscripts, they're going to call on special forces. But that raises the question then, what will the rest of the army do?
Yes, please. I'm not quite sure if this is the question, but when you started talking about the wealth of the country being concentrated up there in a few families, and you talked about the enormous prison population, I thought you were talking about the United States. And when I now hear I also made a connection between Egypt and Wisconsin in the last few days. How can this country stay democratic with this same pattern developing?
Well, at the risk of maybe sounding again somewhat pessimistic, which I honestly am not. I am an eternal optimist. You know, the one thing that sort of never ceases to amaze me is here we are over 200 years in the history of this country, and I haven't seen a single acknowledgement, let alone an apology for slavery.
Right.
I haven't seen much acknowledgement, let alone apology for the extermination of the Native
Yeah, the
Americans.
genocide.
You know, and they both, in both cases, you can almost speak of genocide. And it may not be there, but it's certainly not very far from it. There are a lot of things that are perplexing. I think we largely believe that when our Declaration of Independence says that we believe that all men, which obviously exclude most of you women, are born equal. Yeah, we never really meant the Native American. We never really meant the African American. You know, I have a feeling many of these principles, which we today project as being universalists, were never really intended, except by people like Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin and others of the founding fathers who were universalists. But for the rank and file of the people, you know, I mean, this was a period of time when, you know, if you were a slave, you couldn't vote. If you were not a landowner, you couldn't vote. If you were a woman, you couldn't vote. You know, I'm not really sure that these were the case. I am not sure we've sort of caught up with our promises of the past to be the champions of democracy and human rights. It's a great banner to fly, but if you look at our foreign policy, I'm afraid that there's very little to show in terms of carrying that banner elsewhere.
Thank you.
One last question. Yes, please.
I didn't hear you talk at all about Dr. Obaraday. Does he have a role to play? And were you tempted at one point to get on the plane and go in the square and help them out?
El Baradei is not in the picture. He honestly never was. He was a figment of Western media. A small group of intellectuals and members of the Kefaya party saw him as a banner carrier. You know, it's impossible for somebody who's lived away from his country for so long to try to come back. Even if he can connect emotionally, he doesn't have a power base. He doesn't have an affiliation with the people. Unless he started out with a strong popular affiliation. I mean, if he had started out by spending 10 years of his career in government and, you know, fighting the traffic and getting on a public bus and, you know, playing soccer in the street, serving in the military, you know, getting shot at in one of the wars or whatnot, yeah, maybe, you know. But, you know, when you go out of law school and you go to New York to get a doctorate and you spend all your life at the UN, you can't really be parachuted back and say, okay, I'm your savior. You know, that, you know, it happened about 2,000 years ago, but since then, you know, it didn't happen. Personally, I was involved, but my involvement was to advise the leadership of the January 25 movement. I wrote their manifesto, their demands, and played my role as supporter. I spent 50 years of my life here, and I don't have the ego or the craziness to think that I should go back at my age and people are suddenly going to follow me. So I know the limits of my capabilities. I help to the extent I can, but that's the extent of it. Niagara Foundation is fulfilling a very important cultural and educational mission. It is establishing very important bridges between Turkey and the United States, but more importantly, establish bridges between individuals, people to people. And it shows the commonality of the values of Muslims and non-Muslims. And I think this is a very important message
that needs to be communicated from a Muslim country developed as Turkey is to the rest of the non-Muslim Western world.